I think about that song, and when I first heard that song, it made me think of this idea that what holds us back? What keeps us from fulfilling God's invitation to us from moment to moment? And I can think of a number of the masks that society wears and the masks that we wear in our communities, in our cultural settings, that limit us, one another, that impose restrictions or limitations, for example. But there's also an aspect in which the masks that we wear also inhibit ourselves, also prevent us ourselves from actually connecting, not just to one another, but to what I understand as God's kingdom in our midst. No one else to blame. I have to blame myself. Joseph Campbell, in his book, Pathways to Bliss, Mythology and Personal Transformation, it was a posthumous book that was published after his death. One of the things in which he describes our pathway towards bliss is he says that we all have these personas, what Carl Jung called our persona, basically our projected images. We have so many of them, but we have some basic ones that we wear from day to day in different contexts. What Joseph Campbell said is that part of our coming to know ourselves deeply, coming to experience love deeply, bliss deeply, is learning to see those masks, learning to reflect on those masks. And what I want to suggest to you in this whole series, as we listen to others tell their stories, as we listen to different cultural contexts out of which some of these stories come, like next week, DC's own stories, that as we listen to these, what I want to suggest is that it's when we start to open up our narrative. And by that I mean a willingness to question our own solid identities, our own solid stories of definition, our own solid realities, that we open up to one another to begin to hear that there's a story that's much deeper than that. A story which is much more universal that connects us at the heart of creation. And it's the Creator itself, Creator of all creation, of which we are a part of which J. Philip Newell, the monastic leader of the community at Iona, when he said, we are all born of the essence of God. We are all born into the love of God. And even as Methodists, while we have defined ourselves in ways still as a denomination that limit us from truly experiencing the depth of love from one another, and while we are still struggling and will be at the end at the general conference coming next year of just how do we orient ourselves around same-sex relationships in spite of the evidence of deep love, in spite of the friendships we all share and the relatives and the community that we live in spite of all of that, as we struggle with that, there is still somehow at our heart, we are Christ to one another. We are born in the essence of God. And all of our fears and all of our definitions and all of our masks cannot prevent that. We can limit it. We can shut it down. We can create lots of conflict. But we can't stop the reality of the fact that we are all connected in the heart of God. Now, I jumped way ahead. I basically just concluded my sermon. So I need to back up here a little bit. I don't know why I write these things. I never pay attention to them. We all wear these different masks, and it's interesting where we see these come up. And sometimes these masks are projected in ways that we don't even understand because they're part of these stories we grew up in. We all grow up in various cultural backgrounds, in various family settings, in various realities that we end up defining ourselves one against another. So we see it still in the South. So we're still dealing with the same racial issues that we should be way past by now, and yet we're still struggling with these things because these cultural narratives are deeply embedded. And in spite of the reality that it's possible for us to get past them, it's still very difficult. We largely define ourselves in terms of narratives which are based, if you really get down to it, in our fears. And if you really could get to the very core of what most social psychologists discover, the one thing we all long for as human beings, as creatures, you know what that is, right? It's to have $1 billion. No, it's not that. It's to be beautiful. It's not that. It's to have the perfect job. The perfect relationship, finally and once and for all. No? To sleep. Yeah, well, that's a longing that we all have because of our narrative. Our narratives get in the way of that all the time. It's to belong, right? It's to be connected. It's the one thing that defines our defensiveness and our destructiveness. At the same time, it defines our openness towards unity with others, towards connecting with others. But because we get so far past that basic reality of our existence, because all of the stories we've grown up with, all the narratives we grew up, all the communities we grew up, my family was all Republican. They've been Republican all the way down, except for my gay brother, who's a Democrat and gay. Oh my gosh. And sitting at our table, I've talked about our family table before, how much fun it could be because we'd have the animal rights activists next to the NRA gun-toting, licensing animal hunter, and then we have the evangelical next to the gay brother, and it's just all around the table, and you wonder, how in the world do you people not kill each other? Because somehow deep in our core, and that's the only place I believe it is, to this very day I will argue this with all of my family members, that in spite of how we choose to define ourselves, subconsciously in our core, we know we matter. Should I say that again? In spite of it, because we're all different. We disagree on so many things, not to mention we live so differently. But at the very core, in spite of how we are defining ourselves at that table when we gather for our various family events, somehow deep down, and I don't think we all recognize it even, but somehow deep down we know we matter. Each one of us matters. In God's eyes, each one of us matters. Maybe we just don't understand everything. So we continue to thrive as a family because of that. And as I look at this community, one of the things I had this wonderful experience of masks. I got to go to my 40th high school reunion, right? And I kept thinking to myself, as some of my friends had called and said, let's all go, and in my class there were 700 graduating seniors. It's a big school. And so there were lots of groups, lots of defined realities within the school setting, right? That's what high school's like, right? And once you become an adult, that goes away completely, right? You don't have that anymore at all. Now we're far beyond all that. We're much more open and mature, and we see people for who they really are, right? And so that's kind of where I was. I hadn't been to it since 10th. And when I went to the 10th, of course, it was exactly the way it was at high school. It was a lot of the same defined realities, a lot of the same masks and personas that people were projecting. And honestly, kind of like in our story with Jesus, they looked at me and saw the same person they remembered me being in high school, except with not 1/10 the amount of hair I used to have. And we couldn't break past that. I figured at 40 we would definitely have broken past all that. But it wasn't. It was the same realities, the same masks, the same personas. Very few changes, very few modifications, very little vulnerability. Occasionally, I would run into somebody who, it was clear just from the encounter, they would just look at me and go like, are you as lost as I am? And we would just smile, and next thing you know, we were talking about who we really are. We were talking about the struggles we've had. We were talking about what we've accomplished, where we feel like we are in our lives, how most of us, without admitting it, now in our 50s, feel like we're finally getting to start over again and actually be who we were meant to be to begin with. We've let go of so much baggage. That's how a few of us interacted. But a lot of the others, no, it was back to the same mask. And I don't know if you guys know Nancy Lamb, and I probably putting her on the spot here a little bit. Nancy Lamb's one of our local artists, amazing local artist. Just you see some of her murals in various clubs around town and various spots, and in a gallery downtown. She has a gallery spot. She's amazing. What she does is she takes snapshots of social gatherings from above and sort of captures moments as though an observer. So even though we were all in the same class, she was still being herself. So she had her camera, and as she was walking around saying hi to people, the people we all graduated with, she'd be saying, "Hi, how are you doing?" And she'd be taking a picture. And she'd just be capturing these moments. And I asked her once why she did that, because we've stayed friends over the years, and we hung out. I hung out with the artist community when I was in high school. They were the only ones that could understand me, I think. And I don't draw or have no artistic ability whatsoever, other than music. But so I asked her once, I said, "Why do you do that?" Because it's not like capturing nature. It's literally capturing these fixed social encounters. And she said, "Because there's so much going on. There's so much narrative that happens there, and it's all fake. It's all superficial." In the most part, occasionally not so much so, but in a generalized way, most of these social encounters are superficial. And I mentioned this in the past before as we talk about the stories we tell one another when we're sitting around dinner and even in our relationships, and even more so in social encounters. We share stories, we listen for stories, we try to find places where we connect. We even embellish our stories a little bit to try to find a way in which to connect, because again, that's one of our primary needs, our biggest drives is this need to belong, to feel valued, to feel worthy or worth something, to be connected. So you see that happening in these superficial settings, in these sort of social gatherings. And again, I'm not saying there's anything terrible about that. I hope you don't hear me as saying that's a terrible thing. Sometimes that's a sane way to deal with life. It's hard to be that vulnerable all the time. It's very risky to be that open and honest and genuine. But when we fail to reflect on the masks we wear, we not only miss an opportunity to connect more deeply with one another, and as I understand, to participate in the kingdom, we not only miss that opportunity, but sometimes the narratives by which we define ourselves are also destructive. They're also limiting and sometimes define us to such an extent that we can't hear God. Around my house, go ahead and throw a couple of these up. About a month ago, this was we were walking by the school that's not 1 block away from us, Stripling Middle School. All up and down the sidewalk, all the way around the school, are these little narratives that people wrote, that the students wrote. I'm not sure if they were 6th or 7th or 8th graders, but there were dozens and dozens and dozens of them. You can't read it from here, but I'll read some of the ones I took a picture of. Just because I'm black doesn't mean I am different, doesn't mean I am ghetto, and doesn't mean that I can't speak my mind. Just because I'm black doesn't mean that I don't have the right to talk to certain people, to sing a certain way, doesn't mean that I can't know. Hang on a second. Doesn't mean that I can't know. No. Oh, I'm sorry. Doesn't mean that I can't eat different foods. Just because I'm black doesn't mean that I should be known as a hip-hop artist. Just because I'm black doesn't mean, well, my phone is not cooperating with me. That you can't look at me and see someone different than you think who I am. There's another one. I like this one. Just because I'm blonde doesn't mean I don't have it means I have a low IQ. It doesn't mean that I'm clueless. It doesn't mean that you should make blonde jokes just because I'm blonde. It doesn't mean I don't know what's going on. Doesn't mean that I can't see what you think. Doesn't mean that I'm weak or that I'm self-centered. Why should that matter? Why should you care other than you should know who I really am just because of the color of my hair. Another one, just because I'm shy. Oh, this one, just because I have scars. I thought, wow, these are kids who wrote these things on the sidewalks. Doesn't mean that I'm lonely. Doesn't mean that I'm emo. Doesn't mean that I'm incapable of making friends just because I have scars. It doesn't mean that I'm not happy. Linda and I read these dozens and dozens and dozens of these sort of opening up kinds of narratives that these kids would write. Some wrote about being gay. Some wrote about being a bully. Just because I'm a bully doesn't mean that I actually don't have feelings. Just because I'm a bully doesn't mean that I am hurt. I'm not hurt inside. All of these amazing little sort of vulnerable moments that these kids were writing. And so Linda and I wrote back and sent it to the principal and asked the principal to read it to whoever the students were, because it was the last week of school. And we wrote back, just because we're old doesn't mean we don't care. Doesn't mean that we can't understand. Doesn't mean that we don't want to know you. Doesn't mean that we can't listen. And we just wrote a series of things just because we're old. But it was so moving. And it reminded me of the profound experience that happens when we let down our masks. I want to finish with a poem that I read this week. Wisława Szymborska was a Nobel Prize winner in literature. She won for poetry. This is what the Nobel Prize Committee, she died in February 1st of 2012. This is what they said when she was awarded her Nobel laureate. Her Nobel Prize. For poetry that, with ironic precision, allows the historical and biological context to come to light in fragments of human reality. The Nobel Commission rightly calls her the Mozart of poetry, but wary of robbing her poetry of its remarkable dimension, they also added, there is something of Beethoven's fury in her poetry. This poem I want to read to you is called Life While You Wait, a bittersweet ode to life's string of unrepeatable moments. That each moment is a fractal decision, part of a larger tree of what-ifs that ultimately add up to our destiny and that invite us to soften the edges of our heart so that we might become more. So I'm just going to read you the last half of this because this is where I found it most profound. Life while you wait, performance without rehearsal, body without alterations, head without premeditation. I know nothing of the role I play. I only know that it's mine, I can't exchange it. I just have to guess what my part in the play is. I can barely keep up with the pace that the action demands. I improvise, although I loathe improvisation. I trip at every step over my own ignorance. I try to conceal my hayseed manners. I try to conceal my instincts for happy histrionics. Stage fright makes excuses for me which humiliate me more. Words and impulses you can't take back. Stars you'll never get counted. Your character is like a raincoat that you button on the run. If only I could rehearse one more Wednesday in advance, or repeat a single Thursday that has already passed. But here comes Friday with a script I haven't seen. Is it fair, I ask? My voice is a little hoarse. Should I even clear my throat off stage? You'd be wrong to think it's just a slapdash quiz taken in makeshift accommodations. She says, I am standing on the set. No, I see how strong the set is. The props are surprisingly precise. The machine rotating the stage has been around much longer than me. The farthest galaxies have been on long before I decided to take this stage. There is no question this must be the premiere, and whatever I do in this moment will become forever what I have done. Frederick Buechner, one of our sort of seminarian preacher go-tos that we often went to in seminary, profound writer, used to say that this right here, the worship service, this gathering, it's rehearsal, it's practice. I've heard people come in here who have visited before and literally heard them say, it feels like the kingdom of God in here. I'm taken aback by that, but I know exactly what they're saying. Something feels open in here. Something feels accepting in this room. Something feels willing to be vulnerable and to be present with one another, even in awkward types of situations. When I hear people around the church talking about what is true discipleship, recognizing the stranger, reaching out to those in need, opening ourselves up to one another, I think, oh, we're doing that. This is like rehearsal. This is a reminder of what the kingdom of God can be like. But at the same time, it's a reminder that whatever we do becomes what we had done forever. Amen.